Hi, this is subnetting video number 4, and this video is the first of 3 about finding the range of addresses in a subnet. This video uses as an example subnet number 128.200.96.0 with mask 255.255.224.0. So what should your objectives be in learning about this topic? Well, first off the bat, you need to learn one process to find both the subnet broadcast address and the range of addresses in the subnet. Now, the subnet broadcast address is really just a means to the end of finding the range of addresses, but it's also interesting as an end to itself, and this process shows both. Then you need to practice. The exam, of course, is going to expect you to find these numbers so you can get the right answer to questions, and you need to get faster because the exam has some time pressure. So both of those should be goals. Then you need to practice until it's second nature to find these answers. You don't need to be thinking about what specific step in the process you're in. It should be somewhat natural by the time you're ready for the exam. Next, let's talk about this idea of a subnet broadcast address. First of all, look down at the bottom to the sample network, and on the left, we've got a couple of PCs with IP addresses and a router with an IP address. And if they're using a mask of /19 or 255.255.224.0, then they'll be in subnet 128.200.96.0. All right, so that's the setup for this problem. So now, more generally, what is a subnet broadcast address? Well, it's a special reserved number in each subnet. It cannot be assigned to a host as a unicast address, so you can't just give it to PC1 or PC3 as their IP address. And when we send packets to this subnet broadcast address, the packet is encapsulated in an Ethernet frame that has a LAN broadcast address so that everybody on the LAN gets a copy of the encapsulated IP packet. For instance, let's just say PC2 over on the right is going to send a packet to the subnet broadcast address for the subnet on the left. There's the subnet broadcast address for the subnet on the left listed on the screen. So PC2 sends an IP packet destined for 128.200.127.255. So PC2 just sends it to its default gateway as normal. Router R2 routes the packet as normal to router R1. Nothing special yet. When R1 gets it, R1 notices that it's a subnet broadcast address for the subnet directly connected to R1. So when R1 puts that packet inside a new Ethernet frame, R1 puts an Ethernet destination MAC address of the LAN broadcast address. That means when R1 forwards this frame onto the LAN on the left, everybody, including both PC1 and PC3, gets a copy of the frame, and everybody gets a copy of the packet that's inside that frame. Next, let's talk about our second big piece of information to discover in this video, which is the range of usable IP addresses in a subnet. First of all, the range is simply the numbers between the subnet number and the subnet broadcast address. You can't use the subnet number and you can't use the subnet broadcast address as an IP address for a host, so we have to avoid those, but all the numbers in between the two can be used. For instance, in this video, we'll talk about subnet 128.200.96.0, and we just showed that the subnet broadcast address is 128.200.127.255. So think of those as the bracketed ends of a range of numbers, while the first assignable address, first address you can use is one bigger than the subnet number, as you see there on the screen. And the last number is 128.200.127.254 in this case, which is one less than the subnet broadcast address. So once you know the subnet number and the subnet broadcast address, finding the first and last assignable IP address is pretty simple. They're just one bigger than the subnet number and one less than the broadcast address. Next, let's talk about the example in this video. This video starts with a subnet number and mask. But back in video 1, we started with an IP address and a mask and calculated the subnet number. And it's the same subnet number back in video 1 that we're using in this video for the example. So as a review from back in subnet video 1, we started with an IP address and calculated that subnet number you see on the screen here. To do that, we did the kind of work you see at the bottom of the screen. We built a table. We identified the third octet as the interesting octet. We identified the subnet mask value of 224 and the magic number value of 256 minus 224, or 32. Next, let's talk about how to find the subnet broadcast address for this subnet. We've got the table we used to start with the IP address to find the subnet number. So there we see the subnet number of 128.200.96.0. Then we've got a row reserved to write down the first IP address in the range, the next row reserved for the last IP address in the range, and then the final row to write the broadcast address. I like to put that at the bottom because, of course, it's the last number going in sequence, but you can write it anywhere you want on the page. Then, to calculate the broadcast address, first you look at the octets to the left of the interesting octet. For those octets, you simply copy the subnet number's value, 128.200 in this case. Then you look to the right of the interesting octet. For those octets, you simply write down a 255 in the broadcast address. Then inside the interesting octet, as you might guess, the math is a little more interesting. You take the subnet number, then you add the magic number and subtract 1. In this case, you get 96 plus 32 is 128, minus 1 gives you 127. So the subnet broadcast address in this case is 128.200.127.255. Now that you know both the subnet number and the subnet broadcast address, finding the first and last address in the range is pretty simple. To find the first address, you copy the first 3 octets of the subnet number down. Then you just add 1 to the 4th octet. In this case, of course, 0 plus 1 gives you 1. So the first IP address is 128.200.96.1. For the last address, you copy the subnet broadcast address's first 3 octets, 128.200.127, and then you subtract 1 from the broadcast address's 4th octet. 255 minus 1, of course, is 254. So your last IP address in the usable address range is 128.200.127.254. That concludes this particular example, so what should you do next? Try a couple more practice problems right now. You see 2 of them listed on the screen now. Go ahead and get some scratch paper and work on those 2. Both start with a subnet number and a mask. Those happen to match the next 2 subnetting videos, so if you go ahead and practice those 2, watch the next 2 videos, and you can check to see if you're doing the process correctly to find the subnet ID. Then you want to practice until you master the process, until you get the right answer every time, and until you can do it pretty quickly. The IC&D 1 book has several suggestions where you can get some more practice problems, as usual, and the book's DVD has some appendices, and those appendices have some practice problems for this type of problem.